Elliot had been a park ranger at Thornwood National Park for just over 6 years. It was a sprawling, wild place that spread across thousands of acres of dense forest and rugged mountain terrain. Most who visited Thornwood came for the breathtaking views and the serenity offered by such untouched wilderness, but as with any vast, secluded space, the park had its share of secrets and dark tales. The story begins on a crisp autumn evening. Elliot was in the ranger station, reviewing trail camera footage when he noticed something odd, a blur of movement that wasn't like any animal he recognized. It moved with a strange, unsettling gait, almost human, but not quite. Elliot leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make out details in the grainy footage, but then the figure disappeared into the thick underbrush. Perturbed but intrigued, Elliot decided to investigate. He grabbed his jacket and flashlight, locked the ranger station, and headed into the woods. The air was cool, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows between the trunks of towering pines and gnarled oaks. As he walked, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds, rustling leaves, the distant calls of night birds, the scurry of small animals, were oddly absent. Elliot's boots crunched on the dry leaves underfoot, the sound loud in the silence. Reaching the area where the camera had captured the strange figure, Elliot slowed, his eyes scanning the darkness. The beam of his flashlight darted from tree to tree, illuminating patches of underbrush and the occasional startled animal. He found nothing unusual at first, but as he turned to leave, a cold wind picked up, sending a chill down his spine. The wind seemed to carry whispers with it, voices that were almost human but laced with something else, something ancient and foreboding. Elliot stood still, listening. The voices grew louder, forming words he couldn't understand, a language forgotten by time. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Elliot decided it was time to head back. But as he turned to leave, he spotted something in the beam of his flashlight, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, its body covered in what looked like tattered robes, or was it fur? Its face was in shadow, but too bright, unblinking eyes stared back at him. Elliot took a step back, his hand going to the radio at his belt. But before he could speak, the figure vanished as if it had been a trick of the light. Shaken, Elliot hurried back to the station, the sounds of the forest returning to normal around him as he left the clearing. Back at the station, Elliot locked the door and went straight to the archives. He pulled out maps and old records, anything that might give him a clue about what he'd seen. Hours passed as he pored over documents, and that's when he found it, a journal from a ranger who had worked at Thornwood 50 years ago. The ranger had written about a local legend, a creature known as a Skinwalker, a being said to be able to take the form of any animal or person. The journal detailed several encounters similar to Elliot's, each one ending with a warning: to see a skinwalker was an omen, a sign of dark times to come. The wind howled outside as Elliot read, the ranger station creaking under the strain of the gusts. He felt a sense of dread settle over him, the words from the journal echoing in his mind. He knew he needed to learn more, to understand what the appearance of the skinwalker meant for him and for Thornwood. As dawn approached, Elliot made a decision. He would go back to the clearing in the daylight, try to find evidence of the skinwalker, or at least reassure himself that what he'd seen was just a figment of his imagination fueled by fatigue and the eerie stories from the journal. He gathered his gear, his hand hesitating over the old journal. Taking it with him felt like a talisman, a way to connect the past with whatever awaited him in the woods. With the journal tucked into his bag, Elliot stepped outside just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The forest awaited him, shadows lingering in the underbrush, the trees whispering secrets on the morning wind. As he walked towards the clearing, every sense was alert. He was no longer just a park ranger, he was a man on the brink of an unknown and terrifying world. Elliot's steps were cautious as he approached the clearing once again, the early morning mist weaving through the trees like spectral fingers. The The light was dim, the sun still hidden below the horizon, casting a gloom that made the forest seem otherworldly. Each step forward was met with the crackle of leaves and the soft, damp scent of the earth, which did little to ease the tension knotting his stomach. As he reached the clearing, he paused, his eyes scanning the area intensely. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. The air was heavy, as if charged with an electric current, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Drawing a deep breath, Elliot stepped into the clearing. The ground was soft underfoot, the grass wet with dew. He walked slowly to the spot where he had seen the figure the night before, his flashlight casting long shadows that twisted and turned as if alive. Every small noise seemed magnified, every rustle of the leaves a potential signal of lurking danger. As he reached the center of the clearing, Elliot stopped and crouched down, examining the ground. There were marks there, not quite footprints, but disturbances in the dew-covered grass, as if something, or someone, had indeed been standing there. The realization sent a chill through him, a confirmation of his fears that what he had seen was real. Elliot's investigation was interrupted by a sudden, sharp crack behind him. He spun around, flashlight raised, heart pounding. A branch had fallen from one of the nearby trees, landing with a thud a few feet away. Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, chiding himself for jumping at what was clearly a natural occurrence. Yet as he turned back to the marks on the ground, he noticed something else, a faint trail leading away from the clearing, deeper into the woods. The trail was subtle, easy to miss if one wasn't looking closely, but it was there. Without a second thought, Elliot followed it, his need for answers overriding his instinct to flee. The trail meandered through the woods, leading him away from the familiar paths and deeper into uncharted territory. The trees here grew close together, their branches intertwining, forming a canopy so dense that little light penetrated. The further Elliot went, the darker it became, until he was enveloped in a twilight world, his only guide the weak beam of his flashlight. Suddenly, the trail ended at the base of a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. Elliot circled the tree, looking for any sign of the trail continuing, but there was nothing. It was as if whatever he had been following had simply vanished into thin air. Frustrated and increasingly uneasy, Elliot leaned against the tree, trying to decide what to do next. That's when he felt it, a vibration under his palm, subtle but unmistakable. Startled, he pulled his hand away, staring at the tree. Then, slowly, he placed his hand back against the trunk. The vibration was stronger now, a gentle hum that seemed to pulse through the wood. Intrigued despite himself, Elliot pressed his ear against the tree, listening. The hum was accompanied by a whispering, like voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The words were soft and flowing, almost musical, but with a cadence that sent shivers down his spine. As he listened, the ground beneath him began to tremble. It started as a faint tremor, but soon it was undeniable, an earthquake, right here in the heart of Thornwood. Panic surged through Elliot as the trembling intensified, the whispering voices growing louder, more insistent. He stumbled back from the tree, falling to the ground as the earth shook violently. Around him, the forest swayed, branches creaking and leaves rustling in a sudden wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the earthquake ceased. The forest fell silent once more, the whispering voices gone, leaving Elliot alone on the forest floor, his heart racing, his mind reeling with questions. What was this place? What had he stumbled upon? And most importantly, what did the tree, and the voices within it, want from him? Lying there, Elliot knew he couldn't leave, not yet. Not without answers. Slowly, he picked himself up, his resolve hardening. The mystery of Thornwood had deepened, and he was too far down the rabbit hole to turn back now. Whatever secrets the forest held, whatever darkness lurked in its depths, Elliot was determined to uncover them. But as he stood, Facing the gnarled oak tree once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the hunter in this game. He was the hunted, and the real horror of Thornwood National Park had only just begun to reveal itself. As darkness crept over the horizon, Elliot realized he was woefully underprepared for a night in the deep woods. The fading light turned the trees into towering specters, their branches twisting into gnarled silhouettes against the dimming sky. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot heightened his anxiety, transforming the forest into a living, breathing entity with intentions as obscure as the fading light. Despite his fears, Elliot pressed on, driven by a need to understand the unsettling phenomena connected to the ancient oak. He knew that returning to the ranger station for the night was the sensible choice, yet something unspoken and powerful compelled him to stay, to delve deeper into the forest's mysteries. The air grew colder as night fully descended, the temperature dropping rapidly, turning his breath into visible puffs of white. Elliot's flashlight beam seemed increasingly feeble against the oppressive blackness of the woods. As he adjusted the beam, it caught something unusual, a series of old, faded symbols carved into the bark of a nearby tree. The symbols were not random, they were methodically placed, forming a deliberate pattern that seemed to pulse faintly as his light lingered over them. Intrigued, Elliot approached for a closer look, his previous trepidation momentarily forgotten in the face of this new discovery. As he traced the outlines of the carvings with his finger, a sudden silence enveloped the forest. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals ceased, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The silence was complete, unnerving, as if the forest itself was waiting for something to happen. Elliot stepped back from the tree, his mind racing to connect the dots between the symbols, the ancient oak, and the mysterious voices. He pulled out the ranger's journal from his bag, flipping through the pages by the beam of his flashlight, searching for any reference to these symbols or similar occurrences in the park's history. As he read, a chilling realization dawned on him. The journal mentioned a legend, long forgotten by most, of a guardian of the forest, a spirit said to dwell within the oldest tree in Thornwood, a being that protected the forest and could either bless or curse those who dared to disrupt its peace. The journal described the guardian as capricious and powerful, often communicating through signs and omens that only the initiated could understand. Elliot looked up from the journal, his eyes scanning the darkness. Was the ancient oak he had encountered earlier the dwelling of this guardian? Had he, unknowingly, disrupted its peace? And were the symbols another form of communication, an omen perhaps, warning him or guiding him? Determined to find answers, Elliot decided to camp near the tree with the symbols. He set up a small tent, his hands shaking slightly as he did so. The forest felt different at night, it was more alive, more watchful. As he settled inside his tent, the earlier sense of being hunted returned, more profound and terrifying than before. Lying there, wrapped in his sleeping bag, Elliot listened to the sounds of the forest. The silence remained, thick and oppressive. Then, just as he was about to drift into a restless sleep, a low hum filled the air, a sound similar to the one he'd heard by the ancient oak. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through the earth and into his bones. Frozen with a mix of awe and fear, Elliot listened as the hum grew louder, more insistent. It was then joined by a whisper, a voice so clear it was as if someone was speaking directly into his ear. "Seeker," the voice called, a whisper made of wind and leaves. "Seeker, listen and understand." Elliot sat up, his heart pounding. "I'm listening," he whispered back, not sure how to respond or even if he should. "Protect the heart of the forest," the voice continued, its tone urgent, "for dark forces gather at its edges. Your path is a perilous one, but it is yours to walk. Remember, not all who wander are lost, but some are meant to find." Before Elliot could ask what it meant, the voice faded, and the hum dissipated, leaving him in a chilling silence that seemed even more profound than before. As he lay back down, trying to process the encounter, one thing was clear: his connection to the forest and its mysteries was no accident. It was a path laid out for him, a journey he was meant to take. And as the night deepened, the real journey was just beginning. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with an unseen life, ready to unveil their secrets, ready to test his courage and resolve. The forest held its breath, and so did Elliot, waiting for the dawn or whatever would come with the darkness before it. Elliot's night in the forest was restless, a symphony of unknown rustlings and the soft murmurs of the trees overhead. Each noise seemed to carry weight, a message he was still learning to decode. Despite his exhaustion, the fear of what lurked in the darkness kept him alert, his eyes snapping open at the smallest crackle of dry leaves or distant howl. As dawn approached, the shadows seemed to draw back reluctantly, revealing a forest that was both familiar and utterly alien. The first light of day brought little comfort, the early morning mist wrapping around the trees like spectral fingers, blurring the lines between the real and the imagined. Elliot emerged from his tent, stiff and cold. He packed up his gear with trembling hands, each movement deliberate, trying not to make noise although he knew it was futile. Whatever resided in Thornwood was acutely aware of his presence. With the journal tucked securely in his backpack, he took one last look at the tree with the ancient symbols before setting off deeper into the forest. Elliot scrambled to his feet, his back against the tree, as the figures circled, their whispers growing into chants. He didn't understand their words, but their intent was clear. They were here for the tree, for its power, whatever that might be. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was not just a witness, he was a participant, caught in a battle he barely understood. The forest's guardian had chosen him, a park ranger with no knowledge of the supernatural, to stand in defense of an ancient power he could not comprehend. As the figures closed in, the tree's light pulsed faster, and Elliot felt its energy coursing through him, a force that was terrifying and exhilarating. He stood his ground, knowing he could not turn back, that his journey through the dark heart of Thornwood was far from over. The battle for the forest's soul had just begun, and Elliot was now irrevocably part of it. The figures converged tighter, their forms becoming more distinct as they neared the glowing tree. Elliot could see now that they were not human, their bodies were twisted amalgamations of bark and shadow, eyes glowing like embers within their sunken sockets. They were the antithesis of the forest's life force, entities born from decay and destruction, intent on consuming the very heart of Thornwood. The ground continued to shake under Elliot's feet, the rumbling a constant reminder of the power at stake. He felt the energy of the tree coursing through him, lending him strength but also burning inside him like a fire. The pain was excruciating, yet it galvanized him, sharpening his resolve. He understood now that this was no ordinary forest. Thornwood was a living entity, ancient and wise, and he was connected to it, bound to protect its core. The tree had chosen him as its guardian, and he would stand and fight, whatever the cost. The shadowy figures reached the edge of the glowing light cast by the tree. They paused, their bodies writhing as if the light were anathema to them. They raised their arms towards Elliot, and the air around them crackled with dark energy. The whispers turned into howls, a terrible sound that seemed to shake the very air. Elliot braced himself, feeling the tree's energy peaking. In a sudden, desperate move, he placed both palms against the tree's trunk, pushing back against the figures with all the force of his will, channeling the tree's power. The bark under his hands felt alive, pulsing with warmth. The red light exploded outward, a radiant burst that filled the clearing and enveloped the shadowy figures. The scream of the shadow beings was ear-piercing as the light consumed them, their forms disintegrating into ash and smoke. One by one, they vanished, until only Elliot and the tree remained, the light receding to a soft glow that bathed the clearing in a gentle warmth. Panting, Elliot staggered back, the immediate threat gone but the echo of their screams lingering in the air. He slumped to the ground, exhausted, feeling the energy drain from his body as quickly as it had surged. The tree seemed to calm as well, its light dimming to a normal glow, the pulsing subsiding into a steady thrum that hummed through the ground. As dawn broke, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Elliot looked around the clearing. The forest was peaceful now, the air filled with the sounds of birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The destruction wrought by the shadow beings seemed a distant memory, as if the forest had healed itself in the aftermath of the battle. Elliot stood up, his body aching but alive with a newfound sense of purpose. He knew his life had changed forever. Thornwood was more than his place of work, it was his charge, his to protect. And he was its ranger, bound by fate and fire to its survival. The forest welcomed him back as he made his way out of the clearing, the trees arching overhead, whispering not in the unknown tongue of the shadow beings, but in a rustle that felt like gratitude. Elliot walked with a quiet resolve, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was not alone, that the forest was with him. As he glanced back one last time, the tree stood majestic and strong in the heart of the clearing, its glow a soft beacon in the daylight. Elliot knew he would return, night after night, to stand watch over the ancient heart of Thornwood. For he was the guardian now, the protector of a secret as old as the earth itself, a secret that lived and breathed through the deep woods of the national park. As Elliot made his way back through the familiar trails of Thornwood, each step felt imbued with a deeper understanding of the park's hidden depths. The trees seemed to acknowledge his passage with a gentle sway, and the ground beneath his feet felt like an old friend, solid and reassuring. Yet, the memory of the night's eerie confrontation lingered, a stark reminder of the thin veil between the seen and the unseen. Arriving back at the ranger station, Elliot found it untouched, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had unfolded in the depths of the forest. He entered the small building, feeling the mundane comfort of its four walls, a sanctuary of normalcy. But as he sat down at his desk to record the night's events, he found his hands trembling slightly, a physical echo of the night's terror and triumph. His report was factual, detailing the disturbance and his subsequent actions, yet he omitted the mystical elements, knowing how unbelievable they would sound. He documented the location and the aftermath, suggesting plausible explanations for the disturbances that any rational mind would accept. But as he wrote, the glowing heart of the forest, the whispers of its ancient guardian, and the ashes of its adversaries felt more real than the ink on the page. The day passed quietly, and as night approached, Elliot felt a pull, a call to return to the clearing. He resisted at first, wary of facing the darkness again, but the forest's call was insistent, almost soothing. Finally, yielding to the inevitable, Elliot grabbed his flashlight and headed back into the woods. The night was clear, stars twinkling through the gaps in the forest canopy. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, a living breath of the wilds. As he neared the clearing, Elliot felt a sense of homecoming. Stepping into the open space, he saw that the ancient tree stood as he had left it, its trunk still marked with the glowing symbols, though now dimmed to a gentle luminescence. Elliot approached the tree, his hand reaching out to touch its rough bark. As his fingers made contact, a warm pulse of energy greeted him, like the reassuring touch of an old friend. "I'm here," he whispered, not knowing why he felt the need to speak. The forest around him seemed to respond, a soft whisper of wind rustling through the leaves, carrying a message of peace and guardianship. It was then Elliot realized that his role as a guardian was not born of confrontation but of stewardship, a partnership with the forest and its ancient powers. He spent the night there, beneath the tree, not as a sentinel facing down darkness but as a keeper of its profound secrets. When dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink, Elliot stood and stretched, feeling more connected to Thornwood than ever before. As he walked back to the ranger station in the early morning light, Elliot knew that his life had irrevocably changed. Thornwood was not just a place to protect, but a living entity to understand and respect. His nights would forever be filled with its whispering voices, his days guided by its ancient wisdom. Returning to the station, Elliot paused at the door, looking back at the forest that had become his charge. Thornwood's mysteries were deep, and he was but one in a long line of its guardians. With a final nod to the woods, he stepped inside, ready to face whatever the day might bring, secure in the knowledge that when night fell, he would walk the woods again, a ranger not just of the park, but of its soul. The forest whispered back, a sound like laughter carried on the breeze, and the day began anew.